All right, everybody, welcome back to our next class. This is for our next module. Once again, we are broadcasting from the Taj Mahal. We'll pick another location. We'll stay tuned for the next lecture. We'll be picking a new location. We learned briefly from last class. It was a a popular empire that had Islam as its official religion. Take a second. What was the name of the empire built this? Well, it was the Mughal Empire. And I picked the Taj Mahal to show us some of the great achievements that have come out of Islamic civilization. We'll be seeing those all throughout this course, from architecture to music to film to literature, poetry. All right. And as we're learning in these first couple modules, this diversity, it really kind of challenges certain stereotypes that are often negative about Islam. All right, let's take a look at the reading for this week's module. So, this week's module, we are looking at one of the most influential books that I read as an undergrad that I've come back to again and again. A book by a Palestinian American author and literary critic, Edward Said. And this book is about Orientalism. So, a little bit about Orientalism. Orientalism is actually, according to Said and for others who use Said's ideas, Orientalism is very important for us to understand the modern world and how we got the modern world. Okay, so this is hopefully this is an updated map. So we think of the modern world, we think of different countries, countries that are separated by political borders, that have their own distinct culture, uh, places where the country begins and ends, and a new country begins. Well, many of the borders, many of the countries that we think of, while their cultures and religions are really old, the actual political borders, the actual boundaries are relatively new and are tied to an event in American history called colonialism. Let's take a look at colonialism. So, during the time of these major European empires, from France to Britain, much of the world was colonized. And what this means is colonialism refers to the political, social, economic, and cultural domination of a territory and its people by a foreign power for an extended period of time. So one country goes in and sets up a government, sets up colonies of settlers, sets up an army to defend its own unique interests, and they do so on really territories that have historically been home to another culture. An example of this could even be our own history in America, where we can think of British colonies were set up in the U.S. and the impact that that had on Native American populations. Well, much of the world, um, during, especially between, say, for several centuries, was operated by colonialisms, particularly from Britain, France, a little bit of the Dutch as well, setting up colonies around the world. So this begins around the Age of Discovery, let's say around 15th century or so, during which European nations are going to find colonies throughout the New World. And the US will be an example, or what will become the US will be part of the New World. And so this is our colonial era from the 15th to roughly the 19th century, although a little bit of the 20th as well. All right, so it's a historical process, a little bit more about colonialism, whereby one state subdues another state or territory for political or economic advantage. So whether it's the case of Britain or France or these major European powers, Setting up colonies is a way of expanding wealth. So maybe the agricultural resources, the minerals that are of colonies that are being set up in Africa, Asia, the Middle East. These can go back to the colonizing powers country, which can in turn fuel money and resources. Um, and this is by Juan Campo. This is from the Encyclopedia of Islam. Juan Campo is a really great professor that I had the pleasure of working with um, as a student in Santa Barbara. Okay. In addition to the use of armed force, colonialism usually involves the establishment of a colonial government and migration of the new territories by settlers who occupy the most productive land and control important sectors of the region's society and economy. So, a couple pieces. The colonial power is going to send over armed forces, is going to send over um, uh, governing bodies, some type of viceroy or regent to control another country as well. The populations of what will become independent countries down the road, we'll get there. They'll exploit the resources, gold, salt, exploit the human labor, and this makes the colonizing country wealthier and more powerful. All right. Well, why? Why did that happen? Well, let's put greed aside, let's put over power interests aside. There's a whole rhetoric whereby colonizing powers, whether it's Britain or France, they're going to use this to justify their expansions. So, justifying their expansion. So, the colonial world would divide up our globe into certain categories: Orient slash Occident, East slash West. The Oriental Occidental, this is another way of describing an Eastern Western divide. West would come to mean Europe and North America, and the East would include Asia, Middle East, and some people will say is the Africa part of the East, and it depends who you ask, but that was in many circles, the Orient would include Africa. So the East would have the Near East and the Far East. The Near East would really be a lot of the Middle Eastern countries, and the Far East would include things like Japan and Korea. Russia has always been a question mark in the eyes of the colonial powers, but over time we would get another division of the world in the context of the Cold War. We'd have the First World, the Second World, and the Third World. And these categories are open and debatable throughout history. But for the sake of this class, the big thing to know is that the modern history of Islam and the history of Muslim nations and the subsequent stereotypes that we would get about Muslims, a lot of this would arise out of the geopolitics of colonialism. All right, and let's see, here's a map of some of the major colonial powers in the 1800s. You can see much of it will be controlled by the UK. The United States would actually be also become colonies in the 1800s. So much of the world is colonized. By the late 19th century, more of the world is colonized, and our major colonial power of this time, and this is in dark black, this is the British Empire. And the British Empire would actually become the largest and most successful of the colonizing powers throughout much of its history. All right, and as we continue, when we think about colonialism, we can think about its impact on colonized populations. We can think about the economic ramifications of colonialism. We can think about the political ramifications, the cultural, But for the sake of this lecture, we're going to focus on how is colonialism justified ideologically? What was the ideological foundation? This was the topic of interest by Edward Said. Sorry, a little bit of a typo. I'm going to actually edit that right here while we're recording the lecture. Edward Said was a Palestinian American, and he was a literary critic working at Columbia University. And he'll become very influential in the fields of Islamic and area studies. He viewed the politics of knowledge and producing knowledge as related to politics. So there are criticisms of his work, such that maybe he's has kind of a little bit of a confirmation bias. He's only looking at sources of data that confirm his existing theory. But overall, his work is widely cited. And for understanding the rhetoric, the moral justification that colonizing powers would use to colonize others, and where much of the stereotypes of the modern world come from when it comes to colonized communities, such as the Muslims of the Middle East, Indians in South Asia, and a wide variety of other communities. So this is actually going to be a quiz question in this week's module, and we're going to go over it now. What does Edward Said mean by Orientalism? And what problems does he associate with Orientalism? All right, and these are some quotes from our readings. So he's going to start off by saying Orientalism is a way of coming to terms with the Orient that is based in the Orient's special place in European Western experience. The Orient is not only adjacent to Europe, it is also the place of Europe's greatest and richest and oldest colonies, the source of its civilization and languages, its cultural contestant, and one of the deepest and most reoccurring images of the other. In addition, the Orient has helped to define the Europe. So a couple things. It's a way in which Europe has described and talked about the Orient, and the Orient is a place of the oldest and richest colonies of European powers. But this thing called Orientalism, it's a way in which Europe will define itself in relation to an other. Let's go forward here. It will become clearer to the reader that by Orientalism I mean several things, all of them, in my opinion, interdependent. So there's multiple components to this definition, and all of them are interdependent. So we need to find multiple things. The first thing, the most readily acceptable designation of Orientalism is an academic one, and indeed the label still serves in a number of academic institutions. Anyone who teaches, writes about, or researches the Orient. And this applies whether the person is an anthropologist, sociologist, historian, or philologist. So here, Orientalism is an academic discipline. Anyone who's writing or teaching about this is referring to about these other people, this Orient, the East. They're engaged in Orientalism. Related to the academic traditions, whose fortunes, transmigrations, specializations, and transmissions are in part the subject of this study, is a more general meaning of Orientalism. Orientalism is a style of thought based upon ontological and epistemological distinction between the Orient and the Occident. Thus, a very large mass of writers, among whom are poets, novelists, philosophers, political theorists, economists, and imperial administrators, have accepted the basic definition between East and West as the starting point for elaborate theories, epics, novels, social descriptions. So here, he's using a very, very technical language, But this is the key sentence. Orientalism is a style of thought based upon ontological and epistemological distinction between the Orient and the Occident. So this means that there's an assumption that whatever the Orient is, whatever it is, the people of the East, whether it's the Near Eastern people in the Middle East or the Far Eastern folks in Japan or China, these people are somehow inherently different, inherently other than the people of the West, of Europe, North America, the Occident. So it's a way, it's an ideology that assumes these these different people, these different places, the Orient, the Occident, are inherently other than each other. Now that's important for understanding stereotypes. It's assuming all the people of the Orient and all the people of the Occident can be described in certain stereotypical ways, and they're always going to be the mirror opposite of each other. Let's take a look here. All right, the interchange between the academic and the more or less imaginative meaning of Orientalism is a constant one. And since the 18th century, there has been a considerable, quite disciplined, perhaps even regulated traffic between the two. Here I come to a third meaning of Orientalism, which is something more historically and materially defined than the other of the two. Taking the late 18th century as a very roughly defined starting point, Orientalism can be discussed and analyzed as the corporate institutions for dealing with the Orient. Dealing with it by making statements about it, authorizing views of it, describing it, teaching it, settling it, ruling over it. In short, Orientalism is a Western style for dominating, restructuring, and having authority of the Orient. So here, Orientalism is an ideology. It's a system of thought that serves the interest of certain individuals, i.e., those who are in power. In case for Said, there'll be the colonial powers of the Occident. Orientalism is how the colonial powers talk about the colonized and subjugated populations, but talk about it in a way that it's morally okay, that there's a propaganda behind the colonial project where those who are going and colonizing these territories are actually doing the colonized population a favor. And you'll see more examples of this in a video that I've linked to on Orientalism. Okay, so Orientalism is a field of study. It's defining the Occident and the Orient as mirror opposites. This is the second one. The Occident and the West are stereotypical. Now, this word stereotypes here. Scientific, rational, and civilized and peaceful, whereas the Orient/East is superstitious, irrational, uncivilized, mystic, and warmongering. So these are stereotypes that are inherently other than each other. Orientalism links knowledge and power, and that these stereotypes become a justification for controlling and conquering certain people, and they become a moral justification, i.e., well, these people in the East, they're superstitious and irrational. We're going to bring science to them. We're going to bring rational thought to them. Whereas the people in the East are warmongering and violent, we're going to bring peace and civilization. That's the rhetoric. I'm not saying that's the reality. These are the stereotypes and how the stereotypes work in the context of colonialism. And that's the thing about Said. Said's going to say these stereotypes that emerge, even though colonialism and many of the colonial powers have come to an end, we're still stuck with the stereotypes that came out of this. All right, and this is a few more things here. Colonialism is often described here as a civilizing mission or a white man's burden. For the West / the Occident / the European colonial powers to civilize the East, the Orient, those who are colonized. And so there's a lot of racial and civilizational rhetoric of superiority that justifies, in the eyes of those who are out trying to expand power, this justifies why they're doing what they're doing. And Said is going to say that the academic studies, the people in the West who are studying the people in the East, they have a bias. They're biased by these stereotypes. And this bias creates Orientalism, which reinforces the stereotypes and reinforces the interests of certain people in power. All right, these are some of the stereotypes of Islam that will emerge in this context. So Muslims are often viewed as barbaric, violent, and hypersexual. Women are seen as oppressed. The civilizations that are associated with Islam are viewed as being inherently other than that of the West, and it's often talked about a clash of civilization, the West versus Islam. Muslim territories are viewed as lacking any coherent government and are described as being despotic. All right, this all ignores the tremendous diversity, complexity, and rich history of Muslim communities, which we're going to be getting into starting with next week's modules. And that is Said's Orientalism. So you have a little bit of a quiz that's going to ask you to work through the text some more. And you're also going to have a discussion board where I'm going to ask you to maybe apply some of Said's ideas to a case study over the disputes over the building of a mosque in Tennessee. All right. Thank you so much. And as always, stay safe, stay well, and stay tuned.